Have you ever felt like this? Like you're capable of doing a lot of things, you have tons of interests, but somehow none of them ever really turn into something meaningful. If you've ever felt that way, there's a good chance the problem isn't that you're lazy or undisciplined. There's usually a deeper pattern behind it, one most people never realize. And strangely, it often starts with something that seems positive. You get excited by new things easily. You only need a small glimpse of something before your mind starts imagining all the possibilities. You begin learning one thing, and before you've even gotten far, you've already found something else that looks even more exciting. And this doesn't happen because you're incapable. In fact, it's usually the opposite. People with this kind of pattern tend to pick things up quickly. They learn fast, understand concepts fast, and grasp the basics of many different things with ease. That's why, from the outside, it can actually look great. It seems like you have so many doors open, so many paths you could take, so much potential waiting to be developed. Other people might look at you and think, must be nice to be good at so many things, but what they rarely see is what's happening internally. After living this way for years, a lot of people start feeling the same thing. They're constantly busy, constantly moving, always working on something, always thinking about something, and at the same time, they're always exhausted. And the strangest part is that even though they're busy and tired all the time, it still feels like they're not really getting anywhere, like they're running in circles, starting a lot of things but rarely staying with any of them long enough for it to fully become something real. If we slow down and really pay attention, this actually has a lot to do with how the brain works. The human brain naturally tends to crave novelty. Every time we discover something unfamiliar, something we've never tried before, the brain gives us a little reward response. There's excitement, curiosity, that feeling of wanting to dive deeper. And for some people, that effect is much stronger than it is for others. That's why they can become incredibly enthusiastic at the beginning of something. At the start of learning a new skill, starting a project, or chasing a new idea, their energy is through the roof. They can stay up late, focus for hours, and feel intensely alive. But the problem starts showing up when they enter the next phase, the phase that's no longer about exploration, but repetition. The phase where the work becomes about refining, deepening, and continuing what they already started. This is where the excitement begins to fade. There's no longer that sense of novelty, no more surprises. Everything starts to feel familiar. And for a brain that constantly craves new stimulation, this becomes the critical point. The moment attention starts to drift and look for something else that can recreate that same excitement from the beginning. So little by little, the focus shifts. The thing they were once deeply invested in starts getting abandoned, not because it wasn't important, but because it no longer feels as alive as it did before. Now imagine this pattern repeating over and over again across different areas of your life. You start something, feel excited in the beginning, enter the routine phase, start getting bored, then move on to something else. You start over again, and the same cycle repeats itself. Eventually, your life becomes full of starting, but very little ever truly gets finished. Now let's add another factor that often makes all of this even worse: having too many options. If you feel like your life could go in 100 different directions, that you could become this person or that person, try this path, explore that one, it sounds great on the surface, but there's another side to it that people rarely talk about. Your mind almost never feels fully at peace. Every time you try to seriously commit to one thing, there's always a small voice in your head saying, "This is good, but that other thing also looks interesting." Or, "If I focus on this, am I missing out on a better opportunity somewhere else?" So you keep moving forward, but never completely. Part of your attention stays on what you're doing right now, while another part remains stuck on all the other possibilities you haven't chosen. Your energy gets divided, your attention gets divided. And over time, this creates a strange situation where you look productive, but the actual results are shallow. Your life becomes filled with activity, but lacking in depth. Slowly, a strange feeling starts to appear. You feel capable of many things, but as if none of them truly belong to you. You know a little about a lot of things, but there's nothing you've fully mastered. From the outside, you seem busy, maybe even impressive, but internally, it feels like you're standing still. What's interesting is that the real problem isn't having many interests. Having many interests isn't a flaw. In fact, it can be a huge strength. The problem lies in how those interests are positioned in your life. You place all of them at the same level, You treat all of them as equally important. You want all of them to become your main focus at the same time. But the human brain isn't designed to invest deeply in many directions simultaneously. When you try to pull everything to the front at once, the result isn't that everything progresses together. The result is that your focus fractures. It's like having many plants and watering all of them just a little bit. None of them receive enough attention to truly grow to their full potential. That's why people with many interests don't actually need to get rid of that side of themselves. They don't need to become the kind of person who focuses on only one thing for the rest of their life. What they need isn't less, it's structure. They need one main focus that becomes the center, while their other interests still exist, but in a different role. Not as competing priorities, but as supporting strengths. For example, let's say you're interested in many different things, but you choose one primary focus, like creating content. Your interest in psychology can make your content more insightful. Your interest in design can make your visuals more appealing. Your interest in business can help you understand how to grow your channel. Eventually, all those interests begin working in the same direction. Instead of pulling against each other, they start reinforcing one another. And this is where the real potential finally becomes visible. Having many interests doesn't have to scatter you. It can actually become what makes you unique, as long as there's one clear center holding everything together. But there's one more thing that often keeps people trapped in this cycle for years: the habit of waiting until they feel completely sure. A lot of people think, I'll focus once I find the perfect thing. They wait for certainty. They wait for that feeling of, this is it. But in reality, that feeling rarely shows up at the beginning. More often, it appears only after you've spent enough time moving in one direction, after you've invested your time, energy, and attention into it. If you keep waiting until you feel completely sure, you'll stay stuck in the choosing phase forever. And the choosing phase never really ends. There will always be another option, always another path that looks exciting. And as long as you stay there, you never go far enough in any direction to truly build something meaningful. That's why many people who feel stuck in life aren't necessarily stuck because they chose the wrong thing. They're stuck because they never stayed with one choice long enough. So in the end, you don't have to become someone who only does one thing. You're allowed to have many interests, many curiosities, many passions, but you do need one center. You need one main direction, the one that receives the largest share of your time and energy. Otherwise, your life can end up becoming an endless cycle of starting over, and starting again without ever reaching the stage where something fully matures. This too many interests phenomenon isn't really about being lazy or lacking discipline. It's more about the way your brain constantly chases stimulation, avoids boredom, and becomes overwhelmed by having too many options. And if this feels deeply relatable to you, then at least now you have something important. You understand why you often feel busy all the time, why you're constantly exhausted, and why the results so often feel smaller than the effort you put in. Now the question is no longer why this happens, but how to break out of the pattern, because awareness alone changes nothing. Without changing the way you move through life, you'll just keep repeating the same cycle, starting something, feeling excited at first, then slowly losing direction. So we need to talk about this honestly. Getting out of this pattern is not always comfortable. For some people, it can even feel like they're betraying a part of themselves. Up until now, your identity may have been built around having many interests. You see yourself as someone flexible, someone who can go anywhere, someone who doesn't want to be tied down to one thing. And there's nothing wrong with that. But if you keep living that pattern without a clear direction, the outcome stays the same. Busy, exhausted, but never truly getting anywhere. That's why the first and most important step, the one most people avoid, is choosing. Not choosing the perfect thing, not choosing the guaranteed path to success, just choosing one thing that you're willing to make the center of your life for now. And this is usually the moment people start doubting themselves. But what if I choose the wrong thing? That question alone keeps many people stuck before they ever seriously begin. But the truth is, you don't need a perfect choice. You just need a choice that makes enough sense to commit to for a meaningful period of time. Think of this not as a lifelong decision, but as a decision for the next 1 to 3 years. Long enough to grow, long enough to truly experience the process, but not so long that it feels suffocating. This matters because the brain often resists long-term commitment, but responds much better to commitments that feel time-bound. Once you've chosen one main focus, the next step is managing your expectations. This is where a lot of people fail. Many people enter a new path with the same mindset they have always had. They want things to feel exciting quickly, improve quickly, and produce visible results quickly. But the reality is that the phase that actually makes you grow is usually the boring phase. The phase filled with repetition, practice, and tiny improvements that seem insignificant at first. And this is exactly where most people walk away. Not because they aren't capable, but because they start thinking, why doesn't this feel as exciting as it used to? That's why it's so important to understand from the beginning that boredom is not necessarily a sign that you're on the wrong path. In many cases, it's actually a sign that you've finally entered the right phase, the phase where real skill starts being built and things begin to gain depth. If you can stay through this phase, little by little, you'll begin to notice changes. Not instant, not dramatic, but real. And this is exactly the kind of growth you'll never experience if you keep jumping from one thing to another. Now, let's move into something more practical. How do you stop yourself from constantly switching again? The first thing is to limit exploration. That doesn't mean you're not allowed to be interested in new things. It just means you need to create boundaries around it. For example, you can set aside a specific time each week to explore new interests. Outside of that time, your focus returns to your main center. This matters because if exploration is left completely unchecked, it will eventually consume all of your attention. The second thing is to write your ideas down. Every time you come across something exciting, don't immediately jump into doing it. Just write it down. Treat it like an idea parking lot. It sounds simple, but the effect is powerful. Because often, the reason you switch directions isn't that the idea is truly important. It's because you're afraid you'll forget it. Once you write it down, your brain becomes calmer. You know the idea isn't lost and you can always come back to it later. The third thing is to create a minimum time commitment before allowing yourself to switch focus. This is a fairly strict rule. For example, you tell yourself, I'm not changing directions for at least 6 months or even a year, depending on how significant the goal is. This isn't about forcing yourself. It's about giving something enough time to grow. Because without a clear time boundary, every moment of boredom starts to feel like a valid reason to quit, when in reality, it's often just a normal part of the process. The fourth thing is learning how to measure progress correctly. This is another reason many people give up too early. A lot of people measure progress only through major results or visible achievements. But in the early stages, what matters most isn't the outcome, it's consistency. How often you show up, how often you practice, how often you keep doing the work. That's the real foundation. The visible results usually come later. If you focus too much on outcomes too soon, you'll quickly start feeling like nothing is improving, and that feeling will make you want to move on again. And the last thing, and maybe the most important, is learning to become comfortable with the ordinary. A lot of people stay trapped in this pattern because they become addicted to excitement. They're constantly chasing the emotional high that comes at the beginning of something new. The truth is, a life that's genuinely growing rarely feels exciting all the time. More often, it feels steady, quiet, sometimes even boring. But that's exactly where something meaningful gets built. And if you can make peace with that, you'll develop an advantage that very few people have, because most people quit at that exact point. So now, be honest with yourself. How many things have you started but never finished? How many ideas have you abandoned, not because they were bad, but because you moved on too quickly? And out of all of them, try choosing one. It doesn't have to be perfect, just the one that makes the most sense right now. And this time, don't just start, stay. Because the biggest difference between people who eventually become something meaningful and people who keep running in circles usually isn't talent or opportunity. It's their ability to keep going, even after the excitement from the beginning is gone. Now we're entering the part that people talk about the least, and maybe also the most honest part of all. Why can this pattern last for so many years, even after you become aware of it? The answer is that in some ways, there's actually a part of you that benefits from the pattern. It sounds strange at first, but look at it closely. Every time you start something new, you're in a safe position. You're still in the beginning phase, the phase where everything feels possible. There's no proof of failure yet, no real pressure to succeed yet. In that phase, your identity still exists as potential. You can tell yourself, I actually could be great at this. I just haven't fully focused yet. And honestly, that feels comforting. Because as long as you keep starting over, you never have to be fully tested. You never reach the point where you're forced to confront the reality of your abilities in a deep and complete way. But once you stay with one thing long enough, everything starts to change. You begin running into your limits. You encounter real difficulty. You face moments where your effort isn't immediately rewarded with results. At that point, the ego starts to feel uncomfortable because now it's no longer about potential, it's about reality. And without realizing it, many people choose to return to the beginning phase again. They start something new, return to that feeling of excitement, return to the feeling of, I still have endless possibilities. But when this keeps repeating, it becomes an endless loop. That's why it's so important to understand that staying committed isn't only about discipline, it's also about being willing to let go of certain illusions. The illusion that you can pursue every path at the same time. The illusion that you can become anything you want without sacrificing anything else. Because the reality is that every choice automatically closes off other choices, and that's normal. In fact, that's exactly how direction is formed. Imagine two people. The first person starts something new every few months. The second person chooses one thing and stays with it for several years. At first, the first person looks more alive. They have more stories, more experiences, more things to talk about. Meanwhile, the second person looks ordinary. Their routine looks repetitive. From the outside, not much seems to be changing. But if we look a few years ahead, the difference becomes obvious. The first person has many beginnings, but very few things that ever truly become something substantial. The second person may have only chosen one direction, but that direction becomes deep. And from that depth, something important starts to emerge. Strong skills, mature understanding, and eventually, real results. This doesn't mean you have to become rigid. It doesn't mean you can never change direction. But ideally, change should come after you've genuinely gone far enough down a path, not halfway through every time things start feeling difficult. Because if you treat every uncomfortable phase as a signal to leave, you'll never reach the stage where something becomes truly strong. There's actually a simple way to check whether you're growing or just going in circles. Ask yourself, is what I'm doing now deeper than what I was doing a year ago? Not broader, not more varied, deeper. If the answer is yes, then you're probably on the right path. If the answer is no, there's a good chance you're repeating the same old pattern again. Another thing that matters is the way you think about time. People who constantly change focus usually think in the short term. They chase quick results, or at least the feeling of improving quickly. Meanwhile, people who stay committed tend to think long term. They understand that the first few months may feel slow, but when that effort compounds over years, the results can become far greater than they ever expected. This isn't about who's smarter, it's about who's more patient. And patience here doesn't mean sitting around doing nothing. It means continuing to move forward, even when the results aren't visible yet. Staying consistent, even when the progress feels small. So now, think about yourself again. If your life has felt full of potential, but nothing has fully materialized yet, maybe the problem isn't that you lack ability. Maybe you just haven't stayed in one direction long enough. Now imagine if all the energy that's been scattered in different directions were concentrated into one point. How far could you go? How deep could you grow? And what kind of results might appear if you simply stopped quitting halfway through? There's nothing instant about this. There are no shortcuts, but there is one principle that almost always proves true. A clear direction, combined with enough time, will almost always outperform talent that's scattered everywhere. So if there's one thing worth holding on to from all of this, it's not that you need to stop having many interests. It's that you need the courage to choose one and stay with it long enough for it to truly become something real. Because in the end, life is not defined by how many things you start. It's defined by how many things you carry all the way through until they become mature, meaningful, and undeniably real.